Hello everyone, gabestah here. Today we've got the full guide for Heroic Durumu the Forgotten. And if you need just the basic guide with a lot less detail, feel free to click on the annotation there on the screen. So to begin, we'll talk a bit about the raid composition choices for this fight, and then the differences between Heroic and Normal. And then we'll go through the basic phases of the encounter and talk about the changes needed to conquer this on Heroic difficulty. So let's get started. So, as usual, the first thing to decide is your raid composition. And as has been the case very frequently in the recent history, I would highly recommend using a one-tank method for this encounter if you have a paladin available in your raid. Obviously, this will be for frequent hand and protections, which are used to get rid of the stacking healing reduction debuff called Serious Wound that's applied to the tank. If you're able to manage the stacks of that, then there's no need for a second tank on this encounter. The nice thing is that during the Disintegration beam phase, where Durumu is not attacking the tank, this usually will fall off on its own, just given the length of the phase. So generally you only need to worry about removing it for the light spectrum phase or the normal phase that you're seeing, between those. So typically it'll just be a matter of how many stacks your tank and your healers can handle on the tank before it has to be removed. But we usually did it around 6, I think, and that seemed to work just fine. The other thing to consider, of course, is the number of healers. Once again, I would strongly recommend 2 healers for this encounter. The healing requirement is very forgiving, with the exception of the light spectrum phases later in the fight, but because of the delay between those phases, you can utilize pretty much every survival cooldown that you have available in your raid for every spectrum phase, and therefore the healing requirement is not as severe as it might seem. So here we're using 2 healers, monk and a paladin, and things are pretty solid. The actual healing per second over the course of the fight is going to be around 170 to 190,000. And the bursts during light spectrum will go upwards of 400 to 500,000. So quite manageable for 2 healers with raid cooldowns and backup healing and whatnot. So the first major change or addition to Heroic is that of ice walls. And these are kind of a neat mechanic. These basically will spawn 3 different walls of ice that you cannot pass through until you destroy them. And these walls are spawned prior to every major phase within the fight, with the exception of the very first light spectrum phase, where you don't get a wall. However, for every Disintegration beam phase and every subsequent spectrum phase, there'll be an ice wall just prior that you have to deal with. And of course this means killing it so that you're allowed to move around the room to handle the phase as normal. You should also note that the ice walls always spawn in the same shape. It sort of looks like an upsilon or capital Y, with the bottom of the Y always facing toward the entrance of the room, the very center of the entrance. This means that the largest pie shapes between 2 walls are going to be to the direct left and direct right of the entrance. So it's in your best interest to find a specific spot that your raid can be gathered that will be between 2 ice walls when they're about to spawn, so that you're not cut off from other members of the raid, or you're not actually hit by an ice wall when it pops up. Now mechanically, ice walls are interesting in that they basically share health across all these segments within the given wall. So there are 3 unique walls, 1 in each line, but the individual segments of the ice wall will all share the same health pool. So any damage dealt to one segment is also dealt to the rest, or the total. And once the entire health pool of the wall is destroyed, the wall will disappear and you can step through it. What this essentially means is that AE damage is king to get rid of the walls. So things like Chain Lightning or AE from Warlocks, stuff like that, Blade Storm from Warriors, Spinning Crane Kick from Monks, all that stuff is really strong to get rid of ice walls because all that damage is shared. So just basically the more overall DPS you can deal to a wall, the faster it's going to be destroyed and you can get through it. The second addition for Heroic is an ability called Dark Parasite, which is cast by a new eye type that appears around the room called the Evil Eye. This guy essentially will cast Dark Parasite on a random raid member. Anyone is a valid target, even the tank. And when this is applied, it's a 30-second debuff that does shadow damage every 2 seconds, and this damage increases as the buff progresses. So the damage essentially starts off around 100,000 per tick, and it will go up until the final ticks where it's approaching close to 400,000 a tick. It's a lot of damage. So this is primarily a concern for healers, as well as the individual that's targeted to use a form of damage reduction for it. Now, one very unfortunate thing we found is that Hand of Purity from Paladins, like you might expect, does not reduce the damage for this ability, at least the damage over time portion. The 10% of course works. But what this essentially means is that anyone that's afflicted with this needs an outside cooldown that's a direct percent damage reduction or a personal cooldown when the damage gets high and the duration has been going for quite a while. So typically what we do is if it gets applied to someone, we'll heal them for the first 20 seconds or so. And if they don't have any cooldowns after that, then we'll dispel the player. It is a magic dispellable debuff, so your healers can get rid of it as soon as they want. Now, as soon as you dispel Dark Parasite, it will create a Dark Plague effect. And this debuff has the same existing duration that the previous Dark Parasite had when you dispelled it. So if you have 10 seconds left on Dark Parasite and you dispel it, a Dark Plague will be applied to that player with 10 seconds of duration. Every 3 seconds that Dark Plague is active, it will spawn a new ad called a Wandering Eye that will attach to a random player in the raid. Wandering Eyes are not all that dangerous, but they have about 300,000 health, and they essentially will cast Devour on that player every 2 seconds, which does 50,000 damage. In addition to that, any damage that a Wandering Eye takes is mirrored at a rate of 70% through the player that's afflicted. So you can essentially think of a Wandering Eye as a small dot on the player that's applied to. Now, to be honest, for a long time, we were trying to mitigate the number of Wandering Eyes we'd get and basically cool down and heal through the damage of Dark Parasite. Let me tell you that that's not the way to do it. Dark Parasite is way more difficult to handle than Wandering Eyes are. Essentially, Wandering Eyes can pretty much be ignored once they appear. I wouldn't dispel Dark Parasite immediately because you'll get spawns on everyone, and that may be dangerous, but you can easily dispel Dark Parasite pretty early on, even probably 15 seconds in. And with 4 or 5 Wandering Eyes around the raid, it's a very, very small amount of damage. So essentially what we would do is, like I said, dispel around 20 seconds after Dark Parasite has been active with 10 seconds remaining. So we'd usually get 2 to 3 Wandering Eyes around the raid, and then we would just completely ignore them. Just let them sit on the player because it doesn't affect the player in any way. And eventually, minor cleave damage from melee or tanks or whatnot would kill them off. And since the damage over time to the player from a Wandering Eye is around 25,000 damage per second baseline, plus the little bit of damage they'll take when the Wandering Eye takes damage, it's very minor to heal. It's basically what a random heal over time would do from a healer. So I would strongly recommend just mitigating whatever damage you can from Dark Parasite, but don't worry so much about outlasting the duration. We spent a lot of time messing with that and spent way more healer mana and resources than was necessary. We just tried it once and found that Wandering Eyes are weak, so don't worry about them if you get them. Pretty much ignore them, and they will die when you kill ice walls or cleave off the boss or anything like that. Now, the last thing to mention about Dark Parasite is the ability to completely prevent the application of it in some cases. And of course, this is very handy for saving healer mana, not getting Wandering Eyes, all that stuff. So there are probably a few ways you can do this, but the one method that we knew about that we used here is to utilize shamans for their grounding totem. The basic idea is that if Dark Parasite is cast on a party member with a shaman that has grounding totem active and in range, the grounding totem will absorb the effect, and therefore it won't be applied to the player, and it's just ignored for that round. So this can be very useful, as you might imagine. The downside is that there are a few effects throughout this encounter that will absorb grounding effect absorption, and so the timing can be tricky. If one of those effects happens to go off just before Parasite, then obviously that might be absorbed by the totem and you won't get it, the actual Dark Parasite. But still, it will probably prevent the majority of the Dark Parasites if you have 2 shamans in your raid that can cover both groups. So that's what the big red bar is that says Grounding Totem that's popping up on my screen. Is just a reminder for people to drop that, basically. So with that in use, we were able to completely absorb 3 out of the 5 casts that we got during the fight. So pretty handy. If you'd like the import code for weak ores for that pop-up bar, it's based on a DBM timer, but I'll include it in the description below, so check that out. So now we'll cover some tips for handling light spectrum on Heroic. So the first thing you should know is that, did I say English there? Whatever. The first thing to know is that there are still 3 red or crimson fogs that you have to kill to end the phase. However, there are 2 amber fogs as well on Heroic, and then 1 blue fog as well. So what this basically means is that you have to be very careful of your positioning of the yellow beam prior to when it actually starts to travel around the room and is out of your control at that point. We found that usually the 2 yellow fogs would spawn kind of near each other. So what this means is, of course, is that if you can spot where those are, you want to position the yellow beam opposite them if possible. Usually this is not possible based on the ice walls that will occur following the first light spectrum phase. So there you can see the yellow was right behind where I was. So we don't have much choice here about where to go. The guy with the yellow tried to go through the wall, but it wasn't shattered in time. But luckily it traveled to the left here, so we didn't have to deal with it. But if you do get a yellow amber fog to spawn, then the priority is simply to kill it right away. If you don't kill it right away and the fog is unrevealed because the yellow traveled too far, you'll pretty much wipe. It will almost certainly kill you all. So pretty much the order is still crimson fogs at all times as fast as possible, with the exception of if you happen to spawn an amber, then you want to kill that one. The other major tip that helped us a lot is to essentially assign 1 or 2 people that can raid mark the positions of the crimson fogs at the start of the phase. So there you can see as it begins, there's quickly 3 raid marks placed, 2 from our balance druid and 1 from me. And we basically position ourselves whenever possible kind of at opposite ends of the room or looking at different sides so that we can quickly discern where those 3 red marks or splashes occurred and then throw down some markers. It's really useful to have some macros set up for this, since obviously you don't want to be clicking because you have to react very quickly. So by splitting it between 2 people, she essentially has macros for 3 different markers, and I have the 2 other markers, so we don't use the same ones and get rid of them. And then I also have a macro to reset, so that once we're coming up to another light spectrum phase, we can quickly get rid of them all and be ready for the next one. So here you'll see another round. If you look on the ground around us, I'm just staring to see where those red markers are, and there they are. So that was it. So I dropped the one on the left as she did the one on the right near us, and then I did the far one, and she also duplicated those. So it's essentially just a matter of getting 1 or 2 people that can quickly discern where those are and with some reliability, mark them out quickly. From this, then your player that's controlling the red beam knows exactly where to go and can quickly move from one position to the next without fear of running past a crimson fog or having to see if it spawns. This will, of course, really expedite the entire phase. And of course, the faster you get through this phase, the less damage you'll take from fogs and fewer stacks you'll get for future ones and all that stuff. So this will really help, and I strongly recommend having 1 or 2 people set up to do this. You can see here the basic format of the macros you need to make raid markers there, along with the one for resetting as well. So for the disintegration beam phase, unlike Spectrum, this is really no different than the normal version, except of course the addition of ice walls that try to prevent you from rotating. So other than that, you still have a disintegration beam that always faces the entrance, along with the bottom of the capital Y for the ice wall shape that I mentioned before. So this is where the importance of having your raid positioned near the entrance to the left or the right becomes really vital, so that you can be closest to the actual beam where it starts and destroy that wall that separates you, so that you can go either left or right depending on which way the rotation is going. So what we did was pretty much mark something that indicated where the stack-up point was for every ice wall phase. And this is no exception here. So it's actually the mistweaver monk statue you can see there right in front of us. That was just our general marker for where the tank would stand, and therefore where the players or the entire raid would sort of stack up near to start this phase. So you can see we're safely in this pocket to the left of the entrance when the ice wall and the disintegration beam begins, and then we can destroy the ice wall that's near the beam in case the rotation is to the right. In this case it wasn't to the right, so then we're simply already here, and we just destroy the wall on the left before we have to rotate into it. Other than that, once the walls are destroyed, then it's just a matter of rotating just like you would on normal, and of course not killing yourself, which sometimes easier said than done. But yeah, so disintegration beam phase is pretty much the same as long as you position properly at the start, burst that entrance wall down fast, and then move through quickly before the beam actually activates if you have to go the opposite side. So the final core mechanic to really focus on for Heroic, believe it or not, is life drain. This is one of those things that if you don't handle it correctly, this fight is going to be way, way more difficult than it should be otherwise. The main reason for this is because not only will the player take significant damage if you don't handle life drain properly, but the boss is going to heal a lot. And not only does this negate damage you've already done, but of course it extends the fight. And by extending the fight, it means that you'll get more phases that have potential to kill you, especially light spectrum. So as you'll see at the end here, we were able to essentially kill the boss before the third light spectrum phase was an issue. We sort of ignored it at the end and just finished the boss. But if we let life drain heal the boss for even 5% more, which is not very much if you don't handle it properly, then we wouldn't have been able to do that. We'd have to go through an entire light spectrum phase as normal. So anything you can do to really emphasize to your raid that handling life drain is of the utmost importance will greatly benefit you when it comes to actually getting the kill. So there are 2 main things to remember about life drain. The first is that the healing that Durumu gains when draining someone is in direct proportion to the amount of damage that player takes while being drained. So any damage reduction cooldowns, especially strong ones, will almost completely negate the healing that he would otherwise gain, and this further allows a player to absorb a single beam of life drain for a longer duration than they would otherwise if they didn't have any cooldowns. So for example, our Shadow Priest can disperse if he does it before he actually steps into the beam and gets stunned, and therefore soak the beam for a solid 6 seconds or so without essentially adding any healing at all. You know, it's 10% or something, so very minor amount. And that's a huge benefit compared to if a player without any cooldowns were to be in a beam for 6 seconds, the boss would heal a great deal. The second major thing you have to concern yourself with is simply a strong communication and rotation of players into the life drain. Now, you do not want your tank, if you're one tanking anyway, or your healers to ever get life drain. The exception might be if you're stacked up with your raid, like we are here on one side, and you're using, or you're in a phase where there's not really any damage, then in theory, a healer could go into it safely because the other healer would be there to cover the damage. But throughout the rest of the fight, especially in light spectrum phase, you do not want a healer that's often going to be out of range of other healers to step in it because they'll be stunned, there'll be no one to heal them, and they'll die quickly. So generally, I would use just DPS to soak life drain. The best way we found to do this was essentially to always use 3 people for every life drain. This way you can split it up into chunks of about 4 to 5 seconds each. Now, how you do this is up to you. You can use add-ons to help you or whatnot, but the best thing we found is simply to have people communicate and basically call out dibs or shotgun or whatever you call it for the next round of the life drain. So when it's cast on an initial target, there's about a 3-second warm-up period before it actually starts draining them and stuns them. During this time, if the player's not a melee player, they'll want to run kind of far away from the boss. And this will allow the beam to be more easily discernible to the rest of the raid, but also, more importantly, allow future players that are stepping in front of them to actually get in front easier. Whereas if you're right underneath the boss, it can be very difficult to get in front of that player because of the angle. So the first player gets the beam. After a few seconds, they're actually stunned and start taking ticks. And then after 4 seconds or 5 seconds, the next player steps in. This player should already be determined, but basically just being near the player and calling out, okay, I'm next. And then that player is known to be the next person. If they have any damage reduction cooldowns, they can blow those just before stepping in. And then while they're stepping in, then the third player, again, it can be anybody, just so long as they're nearby and can do it, they'll call their name and they'll step in for the third round. And then that player can finish it off. You don't need more than 3 really to do it. But if you only do 2 and you don't have damage reductions, or especially if you have one person that goes up to, say, 10 stacks, the healing's going to be just extraordinary. So again, try to get that's that rotation of hopefully 3 people splitting up evenly so that the healing is as low as possible. If basically Durumu health is stable, it doesn't really go up during life drains, then you're doing it properly. But if you see it start to climb up, especially in 1 or 2% chunks, then you probably need to modify your method a little bit. And that's it. Once you get life drain down, really the DPS requirement will be much easier for this fight. So, I pretty much covered all the overall mechanics and tactics for Heroic, so I thought I would just do a general walkthrough so I can talk about the phase transitions as we go through them. So, to begin the fight, nothing's out of the ordinary. You're really just waiting for that first spectrum phase before you actually start to get any of the major abilities that are present in Heroic. We also choose to Bloodlust at the start, since this is pretty much the time where most people won't have anything else to deal with, and they can just focus on DPSing the boss. And you may see later in the fight, by doing this, we're essentially able to get the boss under 40% before the first life drains even come out. And that seemed pretty ideal, that we could finish the fight before we got too many light spectrum phases. So here you see we raid marked the Crimson Fog locations and then positioned our red beam on the edge of one of those markers. So it can be the far left or far right, it doesn't matter. But that way they can just rotate the same direction and quickly cover all 3 locations of the Crimson Fog. Our yellow beam player also ran to the opposite side of where the yellow spawns appeared. Make sure you communicate with this because often the player with the yellow won't be able to tell where it spawns, but other people might have seen where the yellows are appearing. So just say, yellow move left, or yellow move right, or yellow go opposite, or whatever it is. And that will help out quite a bit. Now this isn't always possible, of course, when you have ice walls, but when you can do it, it's helpful. So here you can see a couple wandering eyes. So we just healed that Parasite for about 20 seconds and then dispelled it. And we got 2 or 3 eyes that we just ignore from that point, and they'll die eventually. And here comes another dark Parasite. And I think this one does get absorbed by the totem. Yeah. So that's very handy. Now here you can see our raid is all kind of on the same side. So when ice walls are coming up, it's really important that everyone's on the same quadrant of the room so that no one is trapped and therefore can't get to the rest of the raid, especially when Disintegration Beam starts to appear, because they'll die in that shadow stuff really quick. So there you can see we broke down the wall that was to our right so that we could move to whichever side was needed. And in this case, it was through to the right side. And then we just finish off the walls kind of in order so that we can rotate freely without worrying about hitting them. And as I mentioned before, AE damage, especially before the ground effects appear, are really strong for the ice walls. So shamans, monks, warriors will all do quite a bit of damage to those warlocks. And here you can see the rotation is pretty standard. Nothing different on heroic that I can tell anyway. And once you know that the rotation is done, you can just stand still, wait for the shadow to go away, and then get back in position. Now after that first Disintegration Beam, you should prepare for the first life drain. So we do this by making sure, again, the raid is kind of all in the same quadrant, because we don't want life drain to be on the opposite side on someone and then not have anyone able to step in when they need to. So here it's on our Shadow Priest who disperses just before it stuns him. Perfect timing there. And then we have our Shaman step in, our Elemental Shaman. And then we have, looks like our Monk, DPS Monk after that. So, as I said, 3-person rotation. If anyone has cooldowns, they can stay in it longer, and it works out really well. Here we got our second Spectrum, this time with the first ice walls for it. But we still got our raid markers out. And I think we had yellow on the right, but luckily yellow rotated left, so we were okay there. But had we spawned a yellow, we just quickly have everyone DPS it down, and it's not a big deal. As is normal, you just want the blue beam to stand stationary, and then kind of split up your raid roughly equal in beams, so 3, 3, and 4 is ideal, based on their role, whatever it happens to be. So generally we have our melee DPS in red, if they can be, our ranged in yellow, and our healers in blue. And for a while we considered the idea of using an add-on or some other way to help each other to distribute ourselves so that we'd get fewer stacks as the fight went on, and basically not go in the same beam over and over. But in the end we found that just focusing on DPS, handling life drain, all that stuff, and killing the boss before it matters is more important. If you only get 2 spectrums or even 3, it's not really going to be the end of the world if you're just standing in the same color every time, which as a healer I do, for example. So once again, before ice walls, we're on the same quadrant, just at the left of the entrance, and we're killing off the wall to the right. That's kind of a bad puddle, but it's not the end of the world. And it looks like we're going left, so we just focus on getting that left wall down now. And obviously you have to be careful for melee, especially that you don't stand in the shadow when you're trying to kill one of the walls as the shadow appears. So other than that, the rotation phases for Disintegration Beam are a great time for extra DPS, especially for melee or casters that can DPS while on the move, because you really don't have anything else to deal with during this, so it's kind of a nice downtime. Healers also can typically regen quite a bit of mana, so another good reason to use a 2-healer setup is that you can spend a lot more mana in Spectrum and non-disintegration phases, and then regen it during that. So now that we're out, boss is pretty low, so we're just looking, we're just kind of deciding in mumble actually whether we can just ignore this final Spectrum phase and soak up the beam damage and finish the boss. And we decide that yes, with his health level we can definitely do that. So we still have to manage drain because we obviously don't want that to be an issue. So that second pickup was a little early. Our druid that got initially only got 1 or 2 ticks, I think. So be careful of that. But still, our monk and our Enhancement Shaman took over just fine after that. So now we're just kind of deciding to split the beams up. And we got a yellow spawn, which is not a big deal. You just have to burn it down very quickly. And we do so there. And then we can just finish the boss. So, that's pretty much it. It's Heroic Durumu, the Forgotten. Poor little guy. Yeah. So get the life drain down, get the management of ice walls down, and then just figure out your markings for the red fogs for light spectrum, and you should get this fight down without too much trouble. Good luck, and thanks for watching.